By the spring of 1945, as the U.S. Third Army pushed through the crumbling landscape of southern Germany, the war George S. Patton was fighting began to change in a way that had nothing to do with enemy resistance. His columns were still meeting pockets of opposition, disorganized, desperate, collapsing inward. But it was no longer the combat that defined each day's advance. It was what they kept finding behind it. The camps were not all the same. Some were vast complexes whose names would eventually become synonymous with the worst of what the 20th century produced. But others were smaller, less visible. Labor camps, transit facilities, improvised compounds tucked into forests or on the outskirts of towns, whose civilian populations claimed to have seen nothing. These smaller camps had not been built to kill on an industrial scale. They had been built to use people, to extract from them every calorie of labor a human body could produce, and then to dispose of what was, left through starvation, disease, or a bullet, when neither worked fast enough. The prisoners inside came from everywhere German authority had reached. French resistors, Polish families, Soviet soldiers who had survived capture only to be fed into a second system of slow destruction. Jewish men, women, and children from Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, rounded up and transported across borders into machinery that most of the outside world still did not fully comprehend. Political dissidents from within Germany itself, people whose only offense had been a sentence spoken aloud or a belief held quietly in the wrong era. Patton had spent a career preparing himself for the realities of war. He had commanded men through North Africa, Sicily, and the hedgerow killing grounds of France. He had walked battlefields where the dead lay so thick the ground itself seemed to have changed composition. He had built, over decades, the psychological architecture that allows a senior commander to function when surrounded by things that would break most people entirely. What his men found behind those fences dismantled that architecture in hours. The diary entries, the reports filed by junior officers, the accounts relayed by staff who had accompanied him on inspections, all of them described the same shift. A commander who had never hesitated in the face of destruction, now standing still. Not because the war had hardened him beyond feeling, but because what he was seeing had nothing to do with war as he understood it. And then, amid the flood of liberations and horrors, a report arrived that was different from the others. Not a camp already emptied, or a facility already abandoned. This one was still active, still populated. Roughly 2,000 prisoners, alive, but operating under a deadline that had nothing to do with rescue. Orders had already been issued from what remained of the MLS command structure. No prisoners were to survive liberation. For the first time, Patton's race across Germany was no longer about territory. It was about whether 2,000 people would still be breathing when his men arrived. The information did not arrive through a single channel. It came from several directions at once, and that convergence was what made it impossible to dismiss. Escaped prisoners, barely able to stand, had staggered into American forward positions, with accounts that were fragmented but consistent. A camp, still functioning, guards still present, prisoners still alive. But not for much longer. A local civilian, approached quietly by an advance patrol, confirmed the location independently. He did not want to be seen speaking. He said only what was necessary, and then he disappeared. Aerial reconnaissance filled in the rest. Structures, perimeter fencing, movement patterns consistent with an active facility. Not abandoned, not winding down, operating. The details sharpened quickly. Approximately 2,000 prisoners remained inside. The camp sat directly in the path of the Third Army's advance, but not close enough to be reached without deliberate effort. And then a name surfaced. Karl Drestell, the commanding officer. He was not one of the architects whose decisions had shaped the system from Berlin. He was not an ideologue. He was something the war had produced in enormous quantity, and which history would struggle to categorize afterward. A man whose defining characteristic was compliance. He followed the chain of command not out of conviction, but because following it was the only behavior the structure had ever rewarded. That structure had now issued its final instruction. No prisoners were to remain alive when Allied forces arrived. The advance was no longer measured in kilometers or enemy positions. It was measured in hours and in lives. By April 1945, Nazi Germany was no longer a functioning state. It was a structure collapsing inward. Communications severed, command lines fractured, entire divisions dissolving into civilians overnight. The government that had controlled most of Europe now struggled to control the roads outside Berlin. But the SS operated differently. Even as the military apparatus disintegrated, SS command networks maintained a final, rigid coherence, not to fight, but to destroy. Across occupied territory, directives moved through what remained of the chain. Camps were to be liquidated, records burned, evidence erased. If prisoners could not be marched deeper into German-held territory, they were to be eliminated in place. Liberation was not to be permitted. The system's last act would not be survival. It would be denial. Inside the camp, that directive had already arrived. Guards moved with a tension that prisoners could sense, but not yet interpret. Routines shifted. Conversations between officers grew quieter, shorter, more deliberate. Some guards avoided eye contact entirely. Others seemed to be preparing, not to defend the camp, but to carry out something that required no defense at all. Drestell received the order the way he had received every order before it. He read it. He acknowledged it. He began organizing its execution, not with hesitation, not with visible conflict, but with the same procedural discipline that had defined his entire service. Outside the wire, American armor pushed forward with everything it had. Inside, preparations moved in the opposite direction entirely. The order had been given. The clock had started. At Third Army headquarters, the report landed on Patton's desk, alongside dozens of others, competing for attention in a war that was producing emergencies by the hour. He read it once. Then he read it again. 2,000 prisoners. An active execution order. A camp that was reachable, but only if everything moved without delay. He called his staff in. The operational question was straightforward, but unforgiving. How fast could a relief column reach the camp? Best case, hours. Worst case, longer than the prisoners had. The margin between the two was not a gap that planning could close. It could only be closed by speed. Patton ordered the column assembled immediately. Armor, infantry, medical support. Everything necessary, nothing excess. Speed over caution, aggression over protocol. The kind of order his commanders had learned to execute without asking twice. But then he did something else. He dictated a message, not to a unit, not to a division commander, but to Karl Drestell personally. The language was measured, calm, precise. It informed Drestell that American forces were advancing toward the camp, that every prisoner found alive upon arrival would be noted, that every prisoner found dead would be attributed directly to him, not to the regime, not to the chain of command, but to him as an individual. It offered no negotiation. It promised no leniency. It simply made the consequences personal. It was the kind of message that only works if the man receiving it still has the capacity to choose. The message was sent. Whether it would matter was now entirely out of Patton's hands. The message reached Drestell in the administrative building at the center of the camp. He read it standing. His officers waited. No one spoke. The language was unmistakable. American forces were coming. Not eventually, but soon. The man who commanded them knew Drestell's name, knew the camp's location, knew what had been ordered. And he had made one thing explicitly clear. Whatever happened next would not be absorbed by the system. It would be assigned to one person. Drestell folded the message and set it down. For years, the structure he served had provided something that men like him required above all else: clarity. Orders arrived. Orders were executed. Responsibility flowed upward. Consequences flowed downward. And the individual in the middle was never asked to carry the moral weight of what he carried out. The system had been designed that way. It functioned precisely because men like Drestell never questioned it. Now, for the first time, someone had reached through that structure and placed the weight directly on him. Outside the building, guards had begun to notice the shift. Voices dropped. Movements quickened without clear direction. Something was being decided, and the uncertainty of it spread through the compound, the way cold moves through a room when a door is left open. The prisoners felt it too, not as information, they had none, but as instinct. The rhythms of the camp had changed. Something was wrong, or something was about to be. Inside the administrative building, Drestell stood with the message on the table in front of him. And for a moment, only a moment, the machinery hesitated. The relief column moved as fast as the roads and terrain would allow, and then faster than either should have permitted. Engines ran beyond safe limits. Drivers ignored routes in favor of straight lines. Armor that had been designed for sustained advance was being pushed into a sprint across ground that offered no guarantees. Every minute mattered, and every minute was being consumed by distance. Back at Third Army headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted from urgency to something quieter and far worse. Waiting. The column had no time to stop and transmit. Communications were sporadic at best, non-existent at worst. Officers stood near radios that produced nothing. Maps were studied again and again, as though staring at the distance might somehow compress it. No updates, no confirmation, just silence and arithmetic. How far, how fast, how long. Inside the camp, the arithmetic was different, but pointed toward the same question. Guards had begun moving with a purpose that no longer resembled routine. Positions shifted. Equipment was gathered. The activity was not chaotic. It was organized, methodical, and unmistakably preparatory. Whatever had been decided was now being arranged. Prisoners watched from behind wire and through gaps in wooden walls. They could not hear the orders. They could not know what was coming from the west. All they had was what they could see. And what they could see was men preparing for something that did not look like retreat. Somewhere between the column and the camp, time was being measured in lives, and it was running out on both sides. In the end, the choice was simpler than it should have been. On one side, a message from an approaching enemy commander promising consequences, invoking personal accountability, offering a way out that required only one thing: disobedience. On the other, the order, issued through the chain of command he had served without deviation for years, clear in its language, unambiguous in its expectation. Drestell did not weigh these options the way a man with divided loyalties might. He did not pace. He did not consult. The structure that had shaped him had long ago removed the architecture required for that kind of deliberation. Obedience was not something he chose in the moment. It was something he had chosen years ago, and every day since had simply been confirmation. He gave the order. What followed was carried out with the same efficiency that had defined every function of the camp. Guards moved to positions. Prisoners were gathered. The operation proceeded not with cruelty performed for its own sake, but with something worse: the mechanical execution of a task by men who had been trained to treat it as procedure. There was no hesitation, no protest from within the ranks. The system performed exactly as it had been designed to perform. It did not take long. When it was finished, the camp did not look destroyed. It looked completed, as though it had finally fulfilled the only purpose it had ever been built for. Silence settled over the compound. The decision had been made, and it could not be undone. The column reached the camp gates without firing a single round. There was no resistance, no defensive positions, no guard standing post. The perimeter was intact, but unmanned, fencing still strung, watchtowers still standing. The entire structure preserved as though it had simply been switched off. The gates were partially open. The first soldiers through moved cautiously, weapons raised, scanning for ambush or organized retreat. They had been trained to expect opposition. They had prepared for a fight. What they found instead was silence, not emptiness. Silence. The kind that only exists in a place where sound has recently stopped. The evidence was everywhere and unmistakable. Bodies arranged not in the randomness of combat, but in the order of something carried out systematically and recently. The ground still disturbed, the air still carrying what it carries in the aftermath of things that language handles poorly. Signs of haste, not panic, but urgency. The work of men who had known time was short and had used every minute of it. Soldiers who had fought across Europe, who had stormed fortified positions and cleared enemy trenches, stood motionless. Some removed their helmets, others turned away, not from weakness, but because the mind requires a moment before it can accept what the eyes have already confirmed. The relief column had moved at maximum speed. They had pushed beyond every reasonable limit. They had done everything that could have been done. And it had not been enough. They had been close, but not close enough. The report reached Patton at headquarters. Those present described no outburst, no profanity, no table struck in anger. He listened. He asked for the details to be repeated. Then he was quiet for a long time. This was not like the other camps, where soldiers had arrived to find survivors clinging to life, where liberation had meant something tangible, where the speed of the advance had translated directly into people saved. This time, every calculation had been correct. Every order had been issued with urgency. The message had been delivered, and none of it had mattered. What remained was not failure in any operational sense. It was something heavier. The knowledge that 2,000 lives had existed in the space between a warning and a decision, and that space had closed before anyone could reach it. Karl Drestell was captured days later, not in a dramatic confrontation. He was found among a column of displaced soldiers and officers moving west, attempting to disappear into the chaos of a collapsing state. At first he was processed like thousands of others. Another name, another uniform, another man claiming he had simply followed orders. But the evidence did not allow him to vanish. The testimony followed. The timeline was reconstructed. The message was produced, read aloud, entered into record, made permanent. He had been informed. He had been given an alternative, and he had chosen, deliberately and without coercion, to proceed. The war crimes proceedings that followed could not restore what had been taken. Justice, after atrocity of that scale, is never restoration. It is only record. But the record was clear. He had been given a choice, and his choice had defined him, permanently, completely, and at a cost that extended far beyond his own life. The war was nearly over. But for Karl Drestell, the consequences were just beginning.